All right.
Okay, thank you so much, Lauren and Lenny, for that wonderful presentation. I'm going to actually continue from where Lenny's left off. We haven't actually planned this beforehand, but I always think of Lenny as my sister from another mother, from another country, and it seems like we were quite in sync with our presentations. So what I'm going to talk about is the way that I have tried to introduce issues of gender sensitivity and awareness into what I do at the university. You know, I've worked in the field of domestic violence for a long time. I think from the time that I was a young legal practitioner, appearing in criminal courts, which was over 20 years ago. Even then, we had such a high rate of sexual and gender-based violence in South Africa. And so this has been something that I've always been interested in, and a field that I've always been active in. Can we have the next slide, Lauren? And so my experience that I'm going to share with you today is that of a legal practitioner, an academic, a mediator, a social justice activist, and a mentor to my law students, because I think it is so important for law students to have this type of guidance as they attempt to navigate the legal profession, especially since at a tertiary institution, there is so much emphasis that is placed on your academic performance and your marks and your getting your degree as soon as possible. I think there is so much more to being a legal practitioner than just the academic qualifications. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, my interest in, I've always had an interest in gender issues. And I remember the first time that I sat up and you know, in shock, I think that gender issues were so problematic and so contentious all over the world was at the Gage conference in India in 2013. I think that is the year that I first met Lenny. And we were sitting in a session, and one of the participants in the session said quite matter-of-factly that he used to beat up his wife, and he carried on with the conversation. And I thought I misheard, and I almost fell off my chair, because here was a professor, a legal practitioner, an academic, who said so matter-of-factly that, you know, without any embarrassment or without any guilt or anything, that he used to beat up his wife. And granted, he used the past tense, and he went on to clarify that you know, he doesn't do this anymore. But as someone who has not been the victim of gender-based violence, it was quite shocking to me. And I think that that raised my awareness, certainly, and made me get involved in South Africa within my institution in a lot more of those kind of issues. Then in 2020 and 2021, with the COVID, and because of my interest in that particular field, there was this, you know, we saw from the statistics, the rise in gender-based violence. And because more of us were getting onto Zoom and onto Teams and having increased virtual interactions, because we were limited geographically to our physical interactions, I found myself getting more and more involved in discussions and workshops and lectures and so on in South and Southeast Asia. At the time, I happened to be in Nepal at the start of the worldwide lockdown, and I was there for almost 7 months before I could return to South Africa. So a lot of the programs that I started getting involved in and so on concentrated were in that area of the world. And, there was this increased awareness then with me personally. And I think something that I passed on to my students, because I was continuing with online lectures and so on, that this issue of gender disparity was evident worldwide, and issues relating to gender seemed to be universal, whether you were in the sort of developed West, as it were, or whether you were in Africa or Asia or whatever. There was this overwhelming need to address issues of gender. And I think, Lauren, last year with that educators, the first educators Hear My Voice workshop that we did, Lenny and Lauren, you guys were there in that as well. I think that sort of made me realize when we, in the discussions that we had around towards the end of the program, around specifically the gender issues, that it made me realize that this is something that needs to be addressed in some way or the other. Next slide, please, Laura. The way that I chose to address this, because I think that for those of us who work in the field of gender education and awareness, it becomes sometimes too much of a mountain to tackle if you think about all the different issues relating to gender. The fact that there sometimes is so much pushback or close-mindedness in certain instances. I decided to deal with it at my institution on a very, very small scale. So in 2019, I began a student volunteer program called the Legal Integration Program. And it's a volunteer program where I invite students from their second, third, and fourth year of their LLB degree to participate in this program. And we focus on things like mentorship, training, practical skills and training, ethics and professionalism. Besides being an academic, I'm also the principal of the School for Legal Practice in my city. This is a school run under the Law Society of South Africa. And basically, it aims to provide for practical legal training skills for candidate legal practitioners post LLB, but before they are admitted as legal practitioners. So it's a compulsory training that they need to complete. And what I found out as part of my duties as the principal of the school was that there was such a disconnect between the practical life skills and professional skills that legal practitioners required, and that a lot of them struggle to bridge the gap between tertiary education or their university and practice. So this program that I started was the legal integration program was a way that I thought to address what we identified as skills that needed to be developed, and other practical skills that needed to be developed in our students. Next slide. We also, in addition to the actual skills and so on, we also, in the program, focused on character building with regard to the personal development of our students, to increase their insights into both their role of a legal practitioner, but also as a functioning member of society, or a well-rounded, well-developed functioning member of society. You know, we looked at the fact that there has to be engagement in the community that you are dealing with. You're not limited geographically to your country anymore. You are part of the global community, and as a global citizen, there are certain responsibilities and so on that you have with regard to personal relationships. And this is where I've tried to introduce the whole gender discussion and so on. How or what do you work on in order to be a better human being? We have in South Africa this concept of Ubuntu, and what it basically translates into is I am because we are. And so it goes beyond the selfish me, what's in it for me, but it requires that you need to be part of a larger community, and in whatever you do, you need to act and behave and take cognizance of the greater good of the community, rather than be a selfish person who is turned into themselves only and looking at personal growth, personal well-being, everything personal, rather than being more community involved and so on. Next slide. So as part of this group, one of the first things that we chose to do, or one of the ways that we kicked off putting into effect some of the projects relating to gender that we were dealing with, was that we had a gender-based violence conference that we arranged together with clinical legal education at University with Lenny. And so Lenny joined us on the very first student conference that we had, where we addressed the issue of sexual and gender-based violence. And, you know, our students, or my students, and let me not speak for Lenny's students in this situation, I think it was a real awakening for our students to realize that sexual and gender-based violence is not something that is endemic to South Africa, especially in light of the fact that in South Africa, we have some of the highest rape statistics and sexual assault statistics in the world, that we're such a violent country when it comes to things like femicide and so on. And so I think with the interaction that we had with University with Lenny CLE students, it became something that our students could rally around, that they realized that this issue is not something that we can, be complacent about and say, well, South Africa is a violent society and we have sexual and gender-based violence and so on. And I think it basically mobilized our students very much to want to get involved in other activities with regard to gender-based violence specifically, but to address the whole issue of gender as a whole. Next slide. So what I've included in the next slide is two of the further gender-based violence conferences we had in 2020. And if you have a look at the topics, you will see that we had speakers from many different countries, and we tried to compare, or we tried to have a comparative discussion on the situations in the different countries from which we had our speakers from. We also, the second event that we had, we also looked at, once again, we had Dr. Irma from Pasadena University, who was our guest speaker at that one, where we looked at the issue of patriarchy and gender-based violence. But we also tried to include the male voices. So we included students, or we had a largely male lineup, because we wanted to hear the voices of men, of our male students, to look at things like toxic masculinity. We looked at things like, should there be gender roles in the fight for gender equality? We looked at what could men do with regard to taking a stand with regard to issues of gender and gender-based violence. So these were some of the things, or this is how I tried to start a conversation on gender just among the small group of students. But what we found was happening was that our students were getting asked to lead discussions. I was being asked to do interviews on the local radio stations, or I was being invited to be guest speakers, and I tried to take my students along with me so that they could get some exposure as well. And it was interesting that the invitations that I'm talking about that we received was not from the students in the group themselves, but it was clearly the legal integration program members who had actually spoken about what they'd been learning, or the activities that they were being involved in, and so on. And we were reaching a much wider audience. So even though we'd started very, very small, the reach that we had from our members wanting to share information, and for a lot of them, it was wanting to actually make a difference in their communities. So they would identify communities, for example, where gender-based violence was an issue, or where child rape was an issue. And, one of the projects that we did was that we put together a resource booklet that we could then distribute to different communities, with things like local numbers of local police stations, our rape crisis centers, our one-stop centers for reporting sexual assaults and gender-based violence, for psychosocial services, and so on. And this was all student, it was a student initiative that I oversaw, but all the work was done by the students. And what was wonderful for me was that you had a situation where even though we had started within a very closed group, you had students now who were very invested in their respective communities, whether it was more in an urban area or whether it was more in a rural area. And they were they were actively trying to identify a need and use the program for fundraising, for community outreach, for sharing of information and so on, which was something that I had not anticipated. But it's obviously something that I'm very invested in at the moment, and trying to do as much as I can to keep that momentum going, because although we have such a progressive constitution in South Africa, we're still very much a patriarchal society, which is still very deeply rooted in custom and culture and so on. And while being respectful of custom and culture and so on, it's very, very important that communities understand that there are protections. There are legal protections in terms of the protections offered by our Bill of Rights and so on. Very, very often, since constitutionalization in South Africa, we've been very quick to jump on the human rights bandwagon and talk about our rights and so on. But I believe very, very strongly that rights are something that cannot exist in a vacuum. That as members of a community, we have to live and conduct our activities in a way that shows respect and tolerance and acceptance, and especially in the field of gender. It is so important that members of a community are sensitized to other viewpoints and to the feelings and the emotions of other people within their society, and not just to be selfish about opinions and expectations and so on. Next slide, Lauren, please. Okay, so we had our one of the activities we did last year was that we had our second annual conference on the elimination of violence against women and children. We were very privileged to have Lauren be a guest speaker at that conference as well, and we will be doing it again this year. It's something that our legal integration program has committed to doing, and so we look forward to presenting that again next year. Next slide. Obviously, another thing that I've tried to do is to expose my students, in addition to the work that we do locally at our university, to expose them to more organizations and more programs and so on. And so we were very fortunate that Lauren presented a session, a workshop to our Nelson Mandela students in 2021. We've been very fortunate to be invited to conferences and exchange programs and so on internationally by other universities and organizations. And so I'm very, very keen to push my students to involve themselves, because clearly our students can't live in a vacuum anymore. And the more exposure they get to what's happening on a global stage, the more I think their minds are open to being socially and politically aware, and to being open to learn from the best practices and the experiences of other jurisdictions, other countries, and so on. Next slide. So in our discussions, one of the things that came up from the feedback that we got from some of the earlier discussions was that we have a large number of students who are part of the LGBTQI plus community. And so to formally give our students an indication that we were an inclusive group, that we were not focusing specifically on one gender or one part of the student community. We had our members participate in a number of talks and activities and so on that were specifically run by members of the LGBTQI plus community. And I must say that they were very, very well received. Our students or have, there is still, because of religious and cultural reasons and so on, there is still a closed-mindedness amongst a certain part of the student body, a certain part of our members. But for the whole, I think that it's promising that even when there is disagreement or there is a willingness to be open to the suggestion of another way of being, to be more tolerant, or to learn to be more tolerant and not dismissive of members of the LGBTQI community. And that has been a very rewarding experience for me if I compare where we are now in 2022 with my group of students as opposed to where we were in 2019, where just a conversation on gay marriage, even though it has been lawful in South Africa for a number of years, caused such chaos in my class when we first discussed it. Next slide. We've also specifically tried to address the issue of sexual harassment, and we've had various people, including politicians and so on, address the issues of gender laws and look at the problems that are faced by members of the LGBTQ plus community and so on. And I think this has led to a lot more questions being asked, and it's actually made the conversation more of a mainstream conversation rather than something that is treated as something that is extreme or something that is not part of a general discussion. I think what has been so mind-blowing for me is that these conversations now form part of the normal conversation and they're not seen as something out of the ordinary anymore. Next slide. Another thing that I'm involved in, and I'm trying to draw my students into, is that at the university we have a transformation office that looks at the transformation on things like gender issues, race issues, and so on. And one of the things that, or I sit on a panel as a gender-based violence expert, and it's still an office that is developing. It is very, very new. But I think what is so good about what we are doing at the Transformation Office is that in issues of sexual and gender-based violence, rather than going the traditional route of suspending somebody from the university, or um, you know, any of the normal types of penalties, that we're looking at things like mediation, sensitivity training, um, education programs that actually spread awareness on gender issues. So rather than treat the symptoms of the problem, we go back to the heart of the problem and try to address those issues. So it's not just about punishing someone who's found guilty of an offense in terms of the sexual assault and harassment code, for example, but actually to put in place programs and support groups and campaigns and lectures and so on, so that the students at our university are more socially aware on gender issues, and so that they are actually more sensitive with regard to what is going on around them, and more sensitive to gender issues that are being part of the mainstream conversation, rather than being swept under the carpet and merely trotted out when it becomes a problem. Next slide. So some of the things that we focused on are looking at restorative justice in South Africa, especially in the context of gender and gender issues. And we are also looking at how to make the reporting and processing of gender-based violence and the support services more accessible to students within the institution who may be needing those services, so that it's not something that is extremely onerous for the student, but to look at processes that can be put in place and that have been put in place to make the process a little less traumatic and a little less onerous for a person who finds themselves a victim of some kind of abuse or harassment, who then wants to make use of the mechanisms that the university provides for them. So next slide. The university is involved in a number of different programs, and we make sure that we have talks and so on that update students and keep them aware of what is going on, and the different forums that are available to them, in the hope that this becomes something that students have some confidence in with regard to getting assistance or enforcing rights should something happen in that kind of situation. If we can just move to my last slide. I don't know who to ascribe these words to, but it's something that I saw on Facebook last night that I decided to steal for my presentation. And I think it sums up what I am trying to do and what I'm trying to instill in my students. And it says basically that you don't have to speak in front of thousands or write books read by millions or have tens of thousands or in social media followers. To have influence on people, you simply have to be present. And I hope that in a small way, I can do that for my students, and that in turn, I can encourage them to do the same for those that they come into contact with. So thank you very much, Lauren, for this opportunity. I hope I haven't taken up too much of time, but thanks so much for this.